Okay, there we go. We should be good to go on recording now.
All right. Well, thanks, Marnie. My screen shared correctly?
Yes, it looks wonderful.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming, everybody. I see that there's a lot more people here today than I anticipated, so that's fantastic. I'm excited to share with you a little bit of information about the winter life of Ohio's bats. And one thing that I would just like to do for beginners is put winter in context for bats. It's hard to really appreciate what their winter lives are like unless we step back and think about their annual cycle. And I like to start thinking about bats' annual cycle when they emerge from hibernation. So I'm going to briefly take you through a year in the life of a bat. And you can start at any point in the year, but like I said, let's start with the end of the hibernation season. So in late winter or early spring, it really depends on the year and it depends on the species. Bats will start to emerge and exit their hibernation sites. And most of us are familiar with hibernation sites in terms of maybe caves such as this one, as well as mines. And when bats emerge from these hibernation sites in late winter or early spring, they embark on a pretty unique spring migration for critters. So unlike birds that might migrate on a north-south basis, bats migrate in every which direction. So this is a figure from a paper published a couple of years ago from Piper Roby from the University of Kentucky at the time. And if you can see the black stars on the map, so there's a black star here in southern Indiana, a black star here in northern Kentucky, several in Tennessee. Each one of those black stars are hibernation sites. In this study, they were caves. And what happens in the late winter and early spring is that bats would emerge from these caves and migrate in what might seem to us as a pretty haphazard direction. From that one cave in southern Indiana, the researchers followed, in this case, Indiana bats. One individual flew north, another individual flew southwest. And if we look at some of those black stars, which are caves throughout Tennessee, we'll see that some bats are going east, some bats are going west, some bats are going north, some bats are going south. This is just a long way of saying that bats' spring migration towards their summer breeding colonies is a pretty unique phenomenon, and they're not necessarily migrating north or south in search of warmer or colder temperatures, but they're in search of very specific habitat features. Here's one of those habitat features a bat might be in search of for the summer months. This is a pine snag. This is actually from Western North America, but you know, a snag is a snag. And some bats will roost underneath these plates of exfoliating bark during the summer months. So if you can see on your screen here, it was a hard picture to take and I was pleased that you could see anything, but you can see these two little bats. They just seem like little gray blobs on the left of this photo here. These bats are just huddled up underneath these plates of bark. This is a warm, safe shelter for them that they can form social groups in and raise their young during the summer months. This is a look at a tree hollow. Some bats roost in large hollow trees. These are Raffinesque figured bats. This is a photo from Kentucky. And this is a photo from here in Ohio. Some bats will roost in anthropogenic sites such as buildings. To my knowledge, this is only 2 summer roosts for little brown bats that I know about in the whole state of Ohio. In this summer roost, we've counted during the summer over 600 bats coming out in a single night. And we're actually trying to determine what the actual population size is over the next couple of years. But just going to show that these anthropogenic sites, as well as the natural sites such as tree hollows and underneath the bark of dead trees, are very important summer roosts for these species. Some bats also roost in tree foliage. This is a picture of a red bat from the Hocking Hills from Crane Hollow. At the end of the summer breeding season, bats undergo their fall migration. Now, this is a pretty interesting period of time, and we're actually at the tail end of it right now. So during the spring migration, it's generally thought that bats move in a straight line, so to speak, between their winter range, like a cave or a mine, and those summer roosts, that they're in a real hurry to get there. They want to start the summer as soon as possible. But in the fall, it's quite a different phenomenon. Bats don't go in a straight line from their summer roosts to their winter roosts, but instead they do something of a meandering walkabout. As they will proceed to their winter hibernaculum, they'll visit other sites and they'll check them out. They'll also check out the other bats that are there. And this is the period of time that many of us call the fall swarm. What the fall swarm is, it's the start of the mating season for bats. Bats have a really cool, at least in this part of the world, bats have a really cool mating strategy where copulation happens beginning in the fall, extends throughout the entire winter. And then for females, ovulation actually doesn't happen until April. So it's a really unique breeding strategy where sex will occur sometimes 6, 7, or 8 months before ovulation and fertilization can even begin to happen. So this is a really interesting and very poorly understood period of time. And some people have suggested, and this is very much storytelling, some people have suggested that it's the fall swarm period that associates bats with Halloween, that during early pagan celebrations occurring during the autumn months, that people would see bats migrating to the entrances of caves where they make these large swarms, and that in this way bats became associated with autumn festivals that eventually led to Halloween. Very much a story, but it's a story that's frequently told, and it does kind of tell a neat little part of bat biology, which is this cool period called the fall swarm. And it's after the fall swarming period that hibernation begins. So if we think about the annual cycle of a bat, to just review, we started, maybe around the beginning of April, the end of March in this part of the world, where bats exit hibernation, and then we take them through late October when hibernation begins. So for approximately half of the year, bats are in this state of hibernation. So what does winter mean to bats, right? What is hibernation all about, and why do bats do it? So if folks want to take a second and maybe throw something up in the chat, right? What do you think winter means for a bat? You tell me. Rejuvenation, no food, hibernation, sleep. Anything else? Any other ideas? I always like lack of resources. Excellent. I always like to know what people think before I tell a story. It's always helps me provide extra context. Babies at the end. Well, that's an interesting one. We'll talk about that. That's a fun idea. Temperature and length of day. Okay. Slowed down metabolism. That one, as we'll see, is absolutely true. Well, let's take a moment then. And let's think about just what conditions bats face during the winter in order to put in context what winter means for them. Well, obviously, in this part of the world, during winter, bats have to contend with cold temperatures. Now, cold temperatures are sometimes difficult for any mammal to deal with, but cold temperatures are especially difficult for a very small mammal such as a bat. And that's because for very small mammals, they have what we call a large surface area to volume ratio, meaning that all of that body temperature that they're normally using their metabolism to generate to be quote unquote warm-blooded, all that temperature rapidly escapes to the surrounding environment through that large surface area. In the summer months, bats can make this work. They eat a lot of insects. But during the winter months, this is just not possible for them because the temperatures are very cold, much colder than where they want their body temperatures to be. And they're contending with a lack of resources, as somebody said. Right? They have very little food in the way of insects. And for much of the winter, they have very little non-frozen water to access. So this is a very difficult time of year to be any mammal, but especially a mammal with a high surface area to body volume ratio. The math just doesn't work in favor of staying hot. So bats have two options during the winter. They can either escape or they can conform. Now, these are just the sciencey words that we sometimes use when we talk about animal ecology. Escape just means migrate. Some bats can go off in search of warmer conditions. They can migrate south for the winter. And other bats can choose to conform. They can choose to overwinter in this environment, but hibernate, essentially adapting and changing their condition to match or conform to the environment. And let's be clear before we talk about the winter lives of the bats that choose to stay and conform, that not all bats make this choice. For example, the hoary bat migrates out of Ohio in the fall, and it does go pretty far south in order to survive the winter, where it can eat and find insects for most of the winter months. So not all bats are going to embark on this winter hibernation that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about now. So what is hibernation? Some of you kind of touched on this already in the comments, which is great. So this is clearly a pretty well-educated audience. So hibernation, if we want to define it pretty rigorously, is a seasonal reduction in metabolism, body temperature, and behavior. And this is achieved through a coordinated suppression of nearly all of the body's physiological systems. What do I mean by coordinated suppression of nearly all those physiological systems? I mean, this animal breathes or ventilates only about once or twice a minute, right? So only 1 or 2 breaths a minute at most. Its heart rate, similar, only 1 or 2 beats per minute. Brain function slows to the point where brain waves are no longer recognizable if the animal's body temperature is below, or its brain temperature is below 5 degrees Celsius. It doesn't go to the bathroom at all when it's in this state, right? So it doesn't urinate, it doesn't defecate, and this goes on and on and on, all the way down to DNA transcription and translation, the sodium potassium pumps that maintain electrical potential across cell membranes, help maintain proper electrolyte balance. Pretty much everything gets slowed down or completely stopped. And this helps the bat essentially abandon the condition that we associate with being a mammal, right? Being quote unquote warm-blooded, having a high core body temperature. Bats that choose to hibernate for the winter abandon those conditions in order to save all of the energy that it takes to stay warm. And so this is what I've always thought is bats' greatest superpower, right? Their ability to survive the winter by completely changing what it means to be a mammal. And so this is a hibernating tricolored bat. This is a photo from a cave in Kentucky. And during the hibernation period, although we just talked about all of those slowing of physiological systems in order to save energy, it really is worth pointing out that hibernation is much more complex than just a bat tuning down its physiology and going into a sleep-like state for several months. That's actually not what happens. Hibernation is pretty complex. And if we look at body temperature, which is what you're looking at here, I have 1 or 2 sciencey slides, sorry. If we look at body temperature over the course of a winter, and I can tell that I'm getting old because this slide is now 10 years old, right? If we look at the body temperature of this tricolored bats from the middle of November to early March, what we can see here is that every 3 or 4 weeks, that body temperature goes from around 4 degrees Celsius sometimes close to 10 and then rapidly falls back down. But then in other instances, it goes to about 27 degrees Celsius, which is going to be in the mid 90 or low 90 Fahrenheit. So what's happening with these bats is that every couple of weeks, they're coming out of this state of physiological suppression. And they'll come out of that state for about 30 to 60 minutes. And during that time, a lot of interesting stuff happens. What's going on during that time? Well, fascinatingly, one thing that occurs is sex. Now, I mentioned that in this part of the world, and please know that this story is unique to northern North America, right? There's very different strategies for bats in other parts of the world, including temperate Europe and Asia. So here, what happens is female bats don't ovulate until they come out of hibernation. But as we said, sex starts to occur during those fall months. And during winter, this continues, right? Males have sperm saved and ready to go, and males will frequently come out of hibernation in order to copulate with a hibernating or active female. So a lot of sex happens for bats during these winter months. Bats are also undergoing what I like to consider minimum upkeep. This hibernation state is not sleep, right? Sleep is a pretty interesting phenomenon that there's a lot of cool research that goes around. But what happens to a bat that's hibernating is it has almost no brain activity. So it's not doing all of the things that our brains and bodies do during sleep. If you were to try and replicate the condition that bats are in to a human being, it would be catastrophic, right? To not move for several weeks. You can't be in a hospital bed for several days without some serious side effects. These bats are completely immobile for several weeks. They don't go to the bathroom for several weeks. They don't drink or eat for several weeks. This is not something that occurs without cost. There's some research that shows that bats need, or really all mammals, by the way, this is a completely universal phenomenon amongst mammal hibernators, is that they come out of hibernation every couple of weeks. And there's some research that shows that they need to do this in order to maintain the connection between synapses in their brain. They need to come out every couple of weeks to avoid damage to the urinary tract or to the colon. And that essentially that if they were to go any longer, they would start to suffer the consequences of what we call hibernation. So by coming out, even for a very brief time, they help to mitigate those costs. Bats also drink quite frequently during the winter. So what's going on during the winter months is, although the bat has fat stored for energy, unlike other mammals that hibernate that do what we call food caching, they might take a lot of nuts or seeds, take them underground where they hibernate. Bats don't have that option. They can't store bugs over winter. So what they need to do is store fat. And that fat will last them 7, 8, 9 months in some part of the world. But they can't do that for water. They can't store enough water to offset the cost of essentially desiccating or drying out all winter. So bats will just over time in the environment just dry out. So when they wake up or arouse from hibernation every couple of weeks, they drink. In many cases, you can see like this tricolored bat has drops of water on its body. Some cases they'll lick their fur to get some water. Some cases they'll lick cave or hibernacula walls in order to get water. So they need to drink quite frequently. And this is one of the major reasons that bats come out of hibernation. Come on, slides. But overall, we think of the winter months as being about saving energy. Remember, there's no food that's available, at least in this part of the world for the most part, for bats during the winter months. So they need to be in that torpid state or hibernation state for as much time as they can. However, whenever they're in that hibernation state, they're saving a lot of energy, but they can't drink, they can't do that minimum upkeep, and they can't have sex. And so these are all important things for bats, but they're mutually exclusive with saving energy. So this sets up something of a conundrum for bats, right? That essentially that there are costs and benefits of the different physiological states that they can be in. Those states being normothermic, right? Or euthermic is a word we typically use, just their regular warm-blooded state. And the other state is hibernation, or what sometimes scientists call torpor. So these are two mutually exclusive events that have very different costs and benefits. So to review, hibernating has lost opportunities as a major cost, right? What are those lost opportunities? They can't drink. They can't have sex. They can't do that minimum upkeep. They can get predated upon. We see this a lot more than people like to admit. There's birds that will predate on hibernating bats. Raccoons, if they can reach them, will predate upon hibernating bats. And when bats are in this state of hibernation, they can respond to a threat. If you go into a bat hibernaculum and you start making a ruckus, 20, 30 minutes go by, all those bats will wake up. But if you're a predator, you don't need 20 or 30 minutes to get a bat. So they're quite vulnerable. They're also vulnerable to freezing. If temperatures get very cold inside a hibernacula, a bat can freeze. So these are some, but not all, of the costs associated with hibernation or torpor. And when we think about being euthermic, which is essentially just being aroused out of hibernation for that 60 or so minutes at a time, the cost here is energy. Over the winter months, there's been studies that show that the greatest amount of energy spent during those 6, 7, 8, 9 months, depending on where in the world you are, come during these 30, 60-minute periods of arousals. Over 95 to 99% of energy during the whole winter is spent during those very brief windows. So there's a dynamic trade-off between being out of torpor and in torpor. And what bats need to do to be successful during the winter is not do just one or the other, but play the cost-benefit game just right. They try and come out of hibernation as frequently as they can without running out of all their energy. That's how they try to balance all of these costs and benefits. So how do bats do that, right? How do they try to come out of hibernation as much as they often can, or as much as they can without starving? Well, one way they do that is by selecting the temperature that they hibernate at. So this little middle figure here is maybe a little bit hard to follow because it is describing several different concepts all at once. But if you just look at the bottom panel of this figure here, what you're looking at along the bottom or x-axis is just a range of temperatures in a hibernation site. So on the far left, it's going from the coldest temperatures that are available to those bats. And at the far right, it's going to the warmest temperature that are available to those bats. And wherever you are in the world, we see a spectrum of available temperatures. At more lower latitudes, we see a wider range of temperatures that are available at a higher latitude. And what we see bats do is bats that have less body fat gravitate, so to speak, towards colder temperatures, because colder temperatures, for slightly poorly understood reasons, keep bats in that hibernation state for longer, and warmer temperatures allow bats to come out of hibernation more frequently. So fatter bats that can afford more arousals tend to hibernate in warmer areas than smaller bats that need to focus more on saving energy. So that was a little bit of some complicated stuff. Let me just check the Q&A to make sure that there's no major questions. All right, so I'm going to answer those later if you all don't mind. And I'm just going to keep going with this, but I hope everyone is still following me. So with that said, hibernation is a dynamic time for bats. They're spending most of their year in this state, and they're spending most of that time almost shut off. But they spend as much time as they can out of that state. And it's a delicate line between coming out too much and coming out not enough. And really over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, right? Bats have evolved to get that line just right. However, this is the part of the story where, what is bats' greatest superpower becomes something of their greatest weakness. And this is the story of white nose syndrome. And I'm sorry, I hate talking about this, but you really can't talk about winter without talking about what white nose syndrome is. So what white nose syndrome is essentially a fungal disease. It's a fungal disease that's caused by a non-native fungus. So a fungus that's not native to North America. We know that it was accidentally brought to North America from Europe, but this fungus is much more broadly distributed across the old world than Europe. It's almost everywhere we look at this point, other than Western North America and Central and South America. This fungus is known as Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which is something of a mouthful, and I'm not going to say it again. But what this fungus is, it's called a cold-loving fungus, which is unusual. Most fungi don't like cold temperatures. They don't grow very well. But PD, which is what we call this fungus, is adapted to cold temperatures. Some people believe that it evolved in Antarctica, right? Or farther northern temperatures at high northern latitudes, and has moved south over time and is just adapted to the cold. And because this fungus is adapted to the cold, it likes underground environments. It thrives in caves and mines where temperatures tend to be cool and stable. Now, note that cold loving can be misleading. It doesn't like it freezing. It doesn't like it sub-freezing. It likes it cold for a fungus but maybe around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. It's kind of near the sweet spot for this fungus. So cold is maybe a little bit of a misleading term, but that's the way we describe it. And so because it thrives in the same environments that bats are seeking out to hibernate, it essentially encounters bats at a time that they're very vulnerable. This fungus is not a bat specialist fungus. It's just a fungus that grows in stuff, right? It's a saprophyte. If you threw a piece of dead wood into a cave, PD would grow on it, unless it got outcompeted by something else, but it would be capable of growing into it. It just grows into any organic material that it can. And to the fungus, a hibernating bat is kind of just dead organic material because even its immune system is almost entirely turned off. So the fungus is able to exploit this condition and it grows into the bat. You can see that oftentimes you can diagnose a bat with white nose syndrome because of the presence of a white fungus on its nose. And what happens is this fungus increases the number of times bats come out of hibernation during the winter. So it's increasing what we call the rate of those periodic arousals, those every 3 or 4 weeks when the bat comes out of hibernation for an hour, it's increasing the frequency of those events. Those events are entirely fueled by fat. And so if you increase those events, you're increasing the rate at which bats burn through their fat reserves, and this causes bats to starve to death. Why does this happen? Why does the fungus cause bats to arouse from hibernation? It's still something that people study pretty intensely. But if we look at where the fungus grows into the bat, although the nose is what the fungus is, or the disease is named for, the most insidious area that the fungus grows in is the wing. So this is the wing of a bat infected with the white nose syndrome fungus that is transilluminated by UV light. So we use UV light of a very particular wavelength. We put it underneath the wing, shine the light up through the wing. And what that particular wavelength of UV light does is it causes a byproduct of fungal growth to glow or fluoresce bright orange. It's actually riboflavin that is being fluoresced here. And what all of these little orange and yellow dots are areas where the fungus is growing in to the wing. What the wing of a bat is it's just a couple of cells thick, right? It's epidermis, which is the outer layer of your skin, tiny bit of dermis, which is right underneath the top layer of your skin, and then another layer of epidermis. It's incredibly thin. And when this fungus starts to grow into the wing, it's essentially eroding it and it's increasing the bat surface area to volume ratio even more. And it might not seem like much, but to a bat that's drying out already during the winter months, this causes them to dry out at an even more rapid rate. And there's some evidence that suggests that it's actually the drying out of the bat that causes them to come out of hibernation, which sets off this whole cascade of events that eventually lead to dehydration, starvation, and death. And it's really pretty dramatic what happens to these bats and these populations over time. This figure is overused. It's sad, but it really helps communicate what happens here. So this red X here is a cave near Albany, New York, where the fungus was first discovered in the winter of 2005 to 2006. There is some interesting evidence that shows that the fungus was present for several years now before it was first discovered, but this is when it was first seen. And what happens is this fungus quite quickly spread from that one cave. So colder temperatures here, dark blue and purple, are where the fungus spread to first after it was first discovered in North America. Warmer colors, green, followed by yellow, followed by orange, and finally red are where the fungus has spread to most recently. And so this takes us all the way up until the end of last winter, 2021. I haven't updated it this year. But essentially what you see is this fungus marches down the Appalachian Mountains, north into Canada, west to the Midwestern states, sort of looks like it stopped in the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain regions. And that's just because we don't know of very many hibernacula there at all. We don't even know where to look. And then all of a sudden just seem to jump right over the Rocky Mountains and head up into the western coast of the United States, where we do know about Hibernacula. So although it's not present in terms of, these are counties that show the documented disease, at this point, I just assume that it is pretty much ubiquitous across North America. And many people even believe that it's likely in Mexico, that we just haven't found it yet. And where this fungus arrives, it causes catastrophic declines in bat populations. So specifically, and this number seems like I made it up, but at this point it is based in many studies. We see a greater than 95% decline in species such as the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the tricolored bat. These are species that were amongst the most common bats in Ohio prior to the arrival of the disease, that are now incredibly rare. The northern long-eared bat was listed as federally threatened a couple of years ago, and just this year was recommended by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to be uplisted, which sounds good, but it is bad, to be uplisted to federally endangered. The tricolored bat was recommended again also to be federally endangered just this year, really only a month ago. And the little brown bat, we expect a decision from Fish and Wildlife Service in terms of a recommendation early next year. So the declines have been so extreme that we've actually seen one species definitely added to the Endangered Species Act to be uplisted, a second to be added, and likely a third as well. Although I would say probably threatened, but I don't know for sure. And this is what some of those declines look like. I show these caves. This is 7 caves and mines in Pennsylvania, where I do a lot of research. And what we found, my colleagues and I, because these counts date back to when I was 8 years old, what these counts show is that conservation efforts prior to white nose syndrome were incredibly successful. So you see that these numbers, although they're not necessarily low, several hundred bats, so maybe 1,000 or so bats, but over the course of 20 or so years, you saw these populations steadily increase as we gated caves and mines. We protected the summer habitats where breeding and reproduction occurs. And then almost overnight, when white nose syndrome arrived in Pennsylvania, by the time it had spread to all these caves, you saw decades of work, really people's entire career just go away, right? When I say their whole career, I mean people spent decades of their lives dedicated to conservation, and they saw all of their hard work just go down the drain due to this non-native fungus. And it was just a horrible story. I stopped this count at 2014 because this is actually when populations in Pennsylvania hit rock bottom. And we are actually seeing a small amount of recovery. And we'll talk about that small amount of recovery in a little bit. So when we think about bats in winter that are threatened by this disease, I picked out 3 of them in that slide. Little brown bat is shown top center here. This is state endangered, and again, it's under federal review, expecting a decision next year. The species has 95% declines. Just beneath it, we see the tricolored bats. That's to become federally endangered, assuming that the public comment period goes as expected, followed by the northern long-eared bat, bottom right. That's the 3 species that I mentioned in the previous slide. The Indiana bat, sort of just to the right of the little brown bats, was already federally endangered, does die from white nose syndrome, but at very variable rates. Some areas are much more affected than others by the species, so it is a bit of a different story from the 3 that I just shared. But those 4 bats are all to be federally listed on some level, I anticipate, by the end of next year. We have 10 species that reside in Ohio. I have 9 of them up here. So that just means that 4 of those 9 species are to be federally listed in the near future as a result of this disease. So it's a pretty dramatic situation. And so I mentioned that recovery a little bit. And before I talk about some of those other species, because I do want to be a little bit broader than just for bats here, before we talk about those other species, I just want to talk about what recovery might look like from this disease, because I don't really like to be a doom and gloom person that just ends it at where things hit rock bottom and just leave you sad on a Friday. I want to talk about something a little bit positive, although please don't take home from this that everything is going to be fine, but take home that people are trying to help and there is some progress. And one way that we think about how bats survive this disease and how we can help them survive the disease is think about disease in the context of what's called the disease triangle. And this is a concept that's borrowed from plant pathology. And what the disease triangle is just a concept that considers life and death from a disease effects as the interaction of the pathogen, in this case, the fungus, the host, the bat, in the environment, the hibernaculum that the disease is occurring in. And all of these points in the triangle, variables that describe each one of these points, are responsible for producing life and death. And so how might bats survive white nose syndrome? Well, one way that we know bats are surviving white nose syndrome is by getting fat. And we'll come back to this in a couple of moments. But essentially, because this disease is causing bats to burn through their fat reserves in the winter months, if bats have more fat, limited, but data does show that they are more likely to survive. This is a very fat northern long-eared bat that one of my students caught just last year, right? And I like to say this bat was dressed up as a Twinkie for Halloween because it was just right before Halloween. So these bats put on a tremendous amount of fat in order to survive the winter. And bats that are even better at it than the rest have just a small edge in order to survive. Another way that these bats can survive is to find environments that have lower pathogen loads. So if you can find an environment that has less of that fungus in it, there's data that support the suggestion that these bats are going to be more likely to survive. One way that we leverage that limited amount of data is we actually try to reduce fungal loads in the environment. We don't do this in natural sites like caves. We don't even do this in mines, but we do have some anthropogenic hibernacula. This is an abandoned railroad tunnel in Pennsylvania, where we actually spray with a non-biocidal agent. So we're not killing anything, but we're actually convincing the fungus, if you will, that it's a drought and the fungus doesn't grow. And we just got our first paper on this accepted last week, showing that by treating the environment to reduce fungal growth actually helps bats survive. Another way that bats can survive is to change the environmental temperature that they're roosting at. So this is really just a different slide for the different points of the triangle. So let me jump back, right? So if we think about the environment, the pathogen, and the host, all determining life and death, if we can alter, right? Or if we can learn enough about the variables for each of those points that are more associated with survival, we can help bats increase survival, right? We can help them get fat. I'll talk about that in a minute. We can help them find environments with lower pathogen loads. And we can help them find cold environments that are colder than that sweet spot for bats or sweet spot for fungal growth around 50 degrees or 10 degrees C. So we can increase the number of sites that have cold but not freezing temperatures for bats in order to help them survive. And some of our research in Pennsylvania is showing that these strategies do bear fruit, that if we help bats find cold temperatures, they respond by increasing growth over several years. Okay, so a little bit of a pivot there, right? So that was a little bit about talking about what winter is like for bats, a little bit about this disease that kills bats during the winter. And I want to take a couple of minutes, I won't be too long-winded, I swear, and talk about broadening our idea about what hibernacula are, because this is going to help us help bats if we broaden our perception of what bats need in the winter. So I talked about caves and mines a lot. These are what we call traditional, or what I call traditional hibernacula, because this has been the focus of almost every bat biologist for, however many years there have been bat biologists. We focus on caves and mines. And this is a mine from Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, that prior to white nose syndrome had the state's largest population of little brown bats, but post white nose syndrome has 0. It's worth noting that caves and mines are not the only hibernacula in the state of Ohio. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say they're not even where most bats are in Ohio. Most bats in Ohio, if you ask me, and this is opinion because there's no way to count all of the bats in all of these non-traditional environments, but if you ask me, most bats are in non-traditional hibernacula. What are non-traditional hibernacula? I just mean this in the context that they are not what biologists typically think about when they think about bats in winter. These are rocks. These are rocks that are not part of caves, mines, and these elaborate subterranean structures. These are cliff lines, rock outcrops, rock shelters, another cliff line, both non-traditional hibernacula where we find bats, but then even relatively small rock outcrops, right? This is just a small rock on the side of a hill. And if you're looking at this red arrow on the picture on the far left, just a tiny crack in that rock, we find bats. The picture in the middle, it's a little bit more of a dramatic overhang in a rock outcrop, but a bat pretty much in the open, just protected from severe shifts in temperature, but still hibernating in a very non-traditional structure. Side of a rock wall on the far right. These bats are not deep beneath the surface. These bats are not really even in that elaborate sometimes of a rock outcrop, but these bats are finding these environments that are protected from freezing temperatures, but are also interestingly quite cold and therefore pretty suitable for survival in the post-white nose syndrome world. And these habitats, again, are far more numerous in the state of Ohio, and I dare say throughout North America, far more numerous than natural caves as well as mines, and are likely where most bats can be found by sheer numbers. And sometimes we find surprising species there. This is a silver-haired bat. We haven't mentioned silver-haired bats yet. Silverhaired bats yet were not known to hibernate in Ohio until just a couple of years ago when we first documented them, because in Ohio, they hibernate in these non-traditional sites. And so expanding our horizons beyond thinking about bats being in caves and mines in the winter is opening up the door to learning about, wow, there's a lot more species here than we thought. Bats are actually hibernating in far more places than we previously thought. And this is not a small observation, in my opinion, because this allows more people to be involved in bat conservation at this point, the most important time in their lives, which is winter. And what we're going to learn about these non-traditional habitats is going to surprise us in the next couple of years. What do I mean by that? Well, I just showed you some cliff lines, some beautiful areas in Ohio, but still beautiful, still dramatic. And many of you might be thinking, well, that's not really that widespread, Joe. Like that's pretty uncommon. Well, it doesn't have to be quite that dramatic. This is a hibernation site used by the northern long-eared bat. So this is currently federally threatened, recommended to be uplisted to endangered next year. And what this white arrow on the picture on the far left shows is the location of this hibernacula in a dry creek bed, right? We have a zoomed in view of that hibernacula right here. Essentially what this hibernacula is there's a fancy French term for it. It's called the milieu souterrain superficial. There's no good English word for it. But what it is essentially a void. It's an air-filled crack in the ground that's covered with dirt on top. This is a picture of a northern long-eared bat, but this crack goes so far back that we had a very long borescope and couldn't actually get to where the bat was in there. We know that it was in there because we tracked it coming in and out each night until late winter when it stopped coming out, or early winter when it stopped coming out of the site. But essentially, This is a surprising habitat that even cave ecologists in the last 2 or 3 years are saying this is one of the more understudied terrestrial habitats on the planet, that we have a diversity of areas that are subterranean, that are far too small for people to access, where we have a surprising amount of animal diversity. And this includes some of our imperiled bats. And what we will learn about where bats are finding these resources in states like Ohio, which are not known for having dramatic cave resources, I think is really going to surprise us. And it's going to open the door to more conservation efforts, in my opinion. Another sciencey figure, but what this essentially shows is bat activity. Sometimes what we do is we study how active bats are during the winter months by putting out bat detectors. And one thing that we can see is if we look at activity, as shown by these box and whisker plots, this is just acoustic activity of bats per night over the course of a winter. We see that bats outside of these, I call them non-traditional hibernacula, are quite high, right? That if we compare activity from acoustic detectors at non-traditional hibernacula to traditional hibernacula, we record just as much bat activity outside cliff faces and tiny rocks such as this as we do caves and mines. We don't know exactly why bats are coming out during the winter and be active. We think it's because they want to switch hibernation sites, but we don't know. And one thing that's important about this is not only are bats just as active outside these non-traditional sites, we actually document bats better during the winter months by trying to put out acoustic detectors than if we just walk around, we look for bats, because oftentimes the bats that are present are going to be hidden in these very cryptic habitats. So there's a very strong possibility that if you have a rocky landscape, that even if you don't see bats, that they're hiding there in areas that are just not accessible to the human eye. Okay, who uses these non-traditional hibernacula? I say they're important, but who are they important to? Well, first, let's start with this species at the bottom left that we haven't mentioned yet, the eastern small-footed bat. The eastern small-footed bat is one of the rarest bats in Ohio. Across its range, this species is known to roost or spend its winter in caves. But what we've learned in the last couple of years is that it also hibernates in these rocky shelters like the photos I just showed you here. So this is a species that's amongst the most poorest understood in the state, relying on these habitats that we traditionally overlook. So these are important habitats to increase our knowledge about bats during the winter. Tricolored bat, to be added to the federal endangered species list as endangered next year. Traditionally associated with only caves, we are now finding them at rock shelters in Ohio and Pennsylvania and in cracks in rock walls. The federally threatened, to be uplisted, northern long-eared bat, traditionally associated with caves. However, I just showed you that really interesting hibernacula in the dry creek bed. If you go back to the literature to the mid-1900s, or approximately 1940, you actually notice that biologists, the early bat biologists in North America, would be confused by the fact that this bat was very common in the summer, but very rare during the winter. It was always counted in low numbers in traditional habitats like caves and mines. And it was speculated in the 1940s that these bats are hibernating in surprising sites. What are those surprising sites? Rocks, these air-filled voids underground. So this is a species that we're mandated to better understand and protect that are hibernating in these cryptic structures. Big brown bats, this is sort of our super bat. This bat hibernates everywhere. Side of a rock wall, your barn, your attic, rocks, caves, and so forth. The little brown bat and Indiana bat are rather interesting. In this part of the world, they are regarded as cave obligate species. However, we do have 1 or 2 observations of little brown bats in these cracks in the side of rock walls. but it's very uncommon. So right now, most of these species in Ohio are found in those traditional habitats, but they are perhaps deeper in them than we have been able to observe so far. I mentioned the silver-haired bat. This is a species historically not associated with hibernation in Ohio that we've recently found exclusively located in rocky hibernacula, so not caves in mines. So this is a species completely overlooked. The hoary bat, now we mentioned this as being our species that migrates out of Ohio. Our last species that we haven't really mentioned is the eastern red bat. Historically, the eastern red bat was lumped in with the hoary bat as being a species that hibernates outside of the state that would not overwinter here. But this is a photo from the Hocking Hills just last winter. I think this was December 21st or 29th. It was just on one side of Christmas. I can't remember which. Overwintering, at least on this particular day, in a hemlock tree. This species historically is believed to just go to the southeastern United States and hibernate in leaf litter, but who knows, right? Maybe this species actually overwinters in Ohio, but we just haven't invested the energy into better understanding that. Hopefully you're getting the sense that there are more unknowns than knowns in bat winter ecology, and that's mostly because we have been so biased in the areas that we look. We've been associating winter with caves and mines for bats, but that is not the way bats see the world, right? Bats see the world as caves and mines are quite rare. Other habitats are far more numerous, and we need to better understand bats now more than ever. And we need to focus on those areas with these non-traditional rocky habitats so that we can protect them. So what does all this mean to you, right? You're interested in bats. Maybe you're interested in bat conservation. Let's take a moment and talk about what the threats and the declines to bats on their winter landscape might mean to you and how you can help. And let's just revisit very briefly our year in the life of bats. So if bats are exiting their hibernation sites in spring, we need to understand that these hibernation sites are far more diverse than caves and mines. They can be dramatic rock shelters, like I showed you, but they can be these really surprising habitats, like an air-filled void in the ground in a dry creek bed. So essentially, when we think about what we can do for bats, many of us have been limited by thinking, I don't have a cave, I don't have a mine, I can't help bats. But really, the areas you might have bats in the winter might surprise you. And any one of us might have habitats like this on our property that if we can identify them, we can also be part in conservation for bats when they need it the most. And this might include, obviously not, blowing up this rocky area that bats are in, but also importantly, we have to understand that when bats come out of these areas that they need healthy forests, that it's not just the hibernacula itself that's important, it's the landscape around it. Because when these bats come out of hibernation, having been racked by this disease for several months, they need food, right? Those food are insects. Those insects live in the forest, right? So the surrounding forest habitat is vital for these animals. So it's vital that we find these habitats, understand them, and then understand how bats rely on the forests around them so that we can better protect those forests and help bats recover the resources that they lost during winter, as well as prepare for hibernation. We need to remember that although winter is right now when our bats are dying, that it's the summer landscape where bats reproduce. And it's the summer landscape where recovery happens. If we put all of our effort into just thinking about winter, we risk missing the whole recovery. Because although bats have sex in the winter, birth doesn't happen during the winter. Birth happens actually in May or late April sometimes, depending on the species. And that's because ovulation doesn't happen until bats come out of hibernation. So if we want our species to recover, we need to recognize that the summer landscape is also vital. And these can be habitats like buildings. Fortunately, we have species that are greatly imperiled that can live just fine in suburban landscapes, in urban landscapes, and in some cases in an anthropogenic structure. This is really a great opportunity for conservation that we should all embrace in order to help these animals recover. If we go back to this period of swarming and mating, just like how I talked about how bats rely on those healthy forests when they come out of hibernation, they rely on those healthy forests when they enter hibernation. Because during the fall swarm, they're not just having sex. I like to talk about it because it's fun, but they're also putting on that fat. Remember that fat Twinkie-like northern long-eared bat? It got to be that fat little Twinkie because there was lots of bugs near its hibernation site. So protecting those forests helps bats not just when they exit hibernation, but it also helps them put on the fat that they need to survive it. And obviously the winter is critical, right? This is when most of our bats are dying. But please know that protecting these winter hibernation sites includes protecting diverse structures, not just caves and mines, but often anthropogenic sites and often surprising sites as well. Okay, so with that, I would like to end my presentation and I would like to open it up for any questions that I might have.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was fascinating. So good. And we do have questions and some good ones as well. Okay, so we're going to jump right in, and folks, just keep adding your questions as we go through, but I'm just going to kind of take them as they came in. So first question is from Jack, and he's asking, what is the normal heart and breathing rate when bats are not hibernating?
So it's hard to say, what normal is, because when a bat is flying, it is a high performance machine. So if a bat is just resting during the day in a tree, in a building, maybe like 60 to 80 beats per minute. Although it's a little critter, its heart rate is pretty fast. I don't know the exact heart rate off the top of my head, but compared to 1 or 2 beats a minute, it's going to be like 50, 60 times greater. When a bat's flying, again, I don't know off the top of my head, but I bet it's going to be over 100, because those bats are really, they're moving fast, and powered flight is a very energetically demanding process. So getting all of that oxygenated blood to those flight muscles takes a lot of work. So that's a great question, because it puts that 1-2 beats per minute into context.
Yeah, for sure. All right, another hibernation question. If males are coming out of hibernation somewhat frequently, does that make the males less susceptible to white nose syndrome?
Yeah, so interesting question, because you would think, I see the logic there, right? They're coming out of hibernation more frequently, so their immune system is turned on more over the course of the winter, which means maybe they can fight off the disease. It's a logical presumption. However, it seems to not be the case. Males actually have a higher mortality rate in captive studies. We don't really have a good study comparing male to female survival with white nose in the wild, but in captive, males die more from white nose syndrome. And that's because they, at least when they were naive and exposed to the disease for the first time, they didn't know how to play the game, so to speak. And to explain what I mean is, we talked about that narrow line between life and death for bats is cost benefit analysis that they each have to make. Males were really heavily focused towards arouse from hibernation, sneak copulations, get as many of those benefits as possible. And the arrival of white nose syndrome, the way males played the game was the worst way to play the game, right? So they really screwed up the cost benefit, at least in the early days. Now it seems like bats have changed the way they behave during winter, and it's really unclear if males still arouse more frequently than females like we believe that they used to. So everything has been sort of turned on its head, and hibernation is something we didn't fully get in the first place, but now the rules are totally different. But at least in the early days, unfortunately, it seemed like males were dying at very high rates because of their hibernation behavior.
Yeah, it's such a good example of the more you learn, the less you know. Like, oh man. All right, another question. Why do bats still copulate when they are hibernating? I didn't know we were going to hear the word sex so much during this conversation. So, hey, even better. The females aren't reproductively active. So what is the point of males trying to mate and produce sperm, which cost energy?
Okay, I'm going to try and not take the next hour to talk about this,
Right.
because it's just such great stuff. So the reason for this is where I want to start answering my question. The reason why bats have sex during the winter is because there's a mismatch in the timing of when females need energy and when males need energy. Specifically, females need their energy most during pregnancy and especially during lactation. Lactation is the most energetically demanding part of reproduction for a female mammal. And so what's going on there is in June and July, females need a lot of energy for reproduction. And so in order to have the most energy, they need to start reproduction a certain number of days. They need to time when pregnancy begins so that lactation begins when insect availability is peaked, right? That means bats need to come out of hibernation late March, early April, and start gestation then. However, if males underwent spermatogenesis at that same time, males would be, they would be out of luck, right? Because they just went through all winter with no energy. Although they can, well, spermatogenesis takes about 64 days to go from an immature spermatogonium all the way to a mature sperm. It takes actually a while, but it's a cool conveyor belt-like system, which is how we produce them nonstop all the time. But it takes a while. So if males start also at the end of hibernation, they just don't have sperm ready. And so bats have evolved this mismatched system as a result, because when females have the energy for lactation, males have the energy to start spermatogenesis. So males ramp up spermatogenesis in the fall, and therefore they got it all. They're just like, I'm going to store this in my testes, and I'm going to be ready to go. And they go at it all winter. And the reasons why they don't wait until spring to have sex is because there's almost certainly, and there's no data on this, there's almost certainly sperm competition, right? Because if multiple males are mating with hibernating females, one of those males gets to be the daddy, right? But who that is such a cool question. It probably has to do with whose sperm is most competitive in the reproductive tract. So it's probably a competition between sperm all winter long.
That's crazy. All right, folks, just a quick reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We've had some really great ones coming in the chat, and I want to make sure we don't miss them. You still with us, Joe? We just lost your video there for a second. Okay, there you are. All right. Next question. When bats are seen out and about during the winter, how do we know, or can we tell whether or not they are just taking a hibernation break or have some other issues such as white nose syndrome?
Yeah, you really can't. So if you just see a bat flying around and you're just like, oh, there goes a bat, you really don't know, right? And what I would say is you should embrace the positive part of that story. You know, I think that it is very tempting if you see a bat active to think it's sick during winter. And really, it's also very tempting to think that during the summer. If most people contact a bat and they're just like, oh, it's lethargic, it must be sick. It's just like, well, actually, bats just have a totally different lifestyle, right? They actually hibernate on a daily basis in the summer as well. And so I always tell people to not put any assumptions on the animal that you just see, right? And it's probably doing better than you think it is. It's just to our perception, it's unusual, right? But we don't see them the vast majority of the time. So we don't really have a good sense of what's usual. So I would say more times than not, if you see a bat zipping around during winter, at this point in time, it's probably normal. Obviously, during the mass mortality stage of white nose syndrome, when the disease just arrived, people would be seeing like flocks of bats flying around on a snowy afternoon in the sunlight and just fall out of the sky dying. And that was a pretty dramatic thing. But we don't really see that. And we don't really see that in Ohio. We are now in what we call the endemic phase, kind of like the coronavirus, right? We're at the point now where the white nose syndrome has been here, and it's been here so long, and it seems like bats have a certain amount of familiarity with it. They're no longer naive.
Yeah. I'm going to skip ahead to this next question because I think it relates to kind of what we were just talking about. So Emma's asking, what can the general public do to help scientists combat white nose syndrome?
Yeah, So the biggest thing I think is, citizen science on some level is very useful. The amount that I have learned about bats in Ohio, that is not like rocket science, let me say. So let me just go back, right? I'm going to answer this question in the same way, I promise you. Right? This building right here, right? This building is owned by the state, right? And this is the state's largest known little brown bat summer maternity colony. We spent a ton of money finding this, right? A ton of energy finding this. The people who work in this building knew all the time that there were bats here. They just didn't know we were looking for them. And so people, if they have bats in their barns, they have bats in their buildings, they have bats in their attics, I want them to tell me about it. So I'm in the process of setting up a specific email for that so that it doesn't flood my inbox. But so maybe don't do it right now. But the state of Ohio is going to hopefully post on their social media in the coming weeks about this effort, and there'll be a specific email address for it. And we're going to start collecting the information that everybody knows about your bats, whether it's summer, winter. I want people to start telling me about it, and so that we can start curating that data in a meaningful way. Another thing that people can do, say you don't know about bats on your property. If you got rocky habitats, right? One thing that we can do is start to look. I can't go around and look into, putting a bat detector, right? This is a bat detector right here, outside every rocky feature to see if there's bats there. But if you do have rocky features, this can be something that we think about working on. You can work on it with a partner, or maybe me, or, buy a little bat detector yourself, or work with, I'm not sure if extension folks help people find bat detectors, but essentially what we need to do is start surveying areas that look like they could be useful for bats and seeing if we have activity during winter. So everybody who has any type of property at this point, you could have interesting bat resources there. We just need to start to look. And if you don't know where to start to look, try and find a bat biologist close to you, and we can help you try and find ways that you can determine if you have some of these surprising habitats during winter. Finally, the other thing that I would say is healthy forests, right? We spend a lot of time as people who are really obsessed with the winter landscape. That's me. Thinking about underground structures, but bats need forests. And before white nose syndrome, most of what people talked about with bat conservation was forests, right? And since white nose syndrome arrived in North America, I like to joke, it's like jingling the keys in front of a kid, right? It's a complete distraction. And then we go off in this other direction and we forget about the thing that we were just so concerned about last week, right? And so forests are key. And so having a recruitment of snags, dead trees in your forests, having just forests for bats to survive and forage in, even if they don't overwinter there, it is so critical. And that's what, I know that folks like Marnie in the extension office really help people understand how forests can be managed for bats. That's another big thing.
Yeah, and I think the important thing you just said is managing forests. So that doesn't necessarily mean doing nothing, especially these days. We can't do that with invasive species coming in. If you have that taking over your understory, that's not a healthy forest for bats. So that's part of it, right?
Yeah,
all
absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Abby asks, so are we not distinguishing between hibernation and torpor anymore? I always thought there was no clear line between them anyways.
Yeah, so that's kind of one I don't go too deeply into the weeds when I talk with folks, because torpor and hibernation, even in the literature, are used in confusing and sometimes misleading and interchangeable ways. The technical way that people define torpor or hibernation is seasonal use of extended torpor bouts, right? And so this is why I don't always define it, because then there's a ton of jargon there. But essentially, torpor is going to be anytime they do that down regulation, that orchestrated suppression of physiology. But bats do that in the summer. They do it whenever they want. And so torpor is just when you do it, right? hibernation is specifically for winter, because we do have terms for extended summer torpor. Hibernation is specifically during winter, and it has to be multiple day torpor bouts. So they have to do it for an extended period of time. It's really like one of those fun things that people like to spend a lot of time pontificating on the definitions of. But they are very similar. Hibernation is just seasonal torpor.
Great. Okay. Emma is asking a question that I get a lot. Does the decline in bat species correlate with an increase of mosquito populations and mosquito-borne diseases?
I mean, I would love to say yes.
Right.
I would love to, because I love that. I mean, I don't love anything about that, but that's a good story for bat PR. I've not seen that data, and those are very challenging ecological questions. Looking at how predators influence prey populations is sometimes deceptively hard. So I've not seen that study yet. However, right? Do I think that it's likely that the loss of millions of bats across North America in the span of just a couple of years led to an increase in bat or insect populations? Yeah, I think that is actually pretty sound logic. Whether it was mosquitoes, moths, beetles, like which insect might have been a winner, there's no data there. But I do think that, there's clearly a huge loss in predators. And I think it would be unlikely that such a huge loss of predators would not relate to some level of increase in prey. However, bat prey is so diverse that could you point at mosquitoes and say mosquitoes increased and then mosquito-borne illnesses increased? I would need some data before I told people that story with any type of honesty.
Okay. Couple questions about bat houses. And Stephanie's asking, what can we do in urban and suburban areas to build non-traditional hibernacula? And then the second part of her question is, what are your thoughts on setting up bat houses, especially in urban suburban areas?
The first one's a little bit controversial. And so I work a lot with anthropogenic hibernacula, and it gets some people kind of peeved at me. And so say I live in Cincinnati, right? I do know of several hibernacula that are in the city. I don't want to say even the type of structure that is, because everyone's going to know what I'm talking about probably. And so maybe if that's something like if you manage property and you actually think that you could do something, maybe you should reach out to me offline so that I don't inadvertently broadcast something that I'm going to regret. But there are ways to do it. The second one is, I think, a little bit easier. The second one was about bat boxes, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so bat boxes, there is also some controversy here. Historically, there was very little concern over putting bat boxes out, that people would just do it. You can buy them on the internet. It's not always going to be successful, but it's not a bad thing. In the last couple of years, there's been some pushback against that, specifically that bat boxes can get too hot, and that the wrong bat box in the wrong place might not just be avoided by bats, but could actually kill bats because they could overheat. I'm thinking about a big black bat box in the middle of a sunny field. Some people think that those are going to be essentially a death trap. So in order to have an impact with bat boxes, because they do have an impact in my opinion, you need to put a little bit of thought into the design of the bat box and where you place the bat box. Unfortunately, that guidance is not as clear as we would like it to be. There are many different designs and people do not agree on what the best ones are. Whoops, it's kind of crummy. However, in my experience, there are a couple of different designs that are really excellent. And so one of them is kind of extensively used in Pennsylvania. I'm trying to export that design to Ohio. And what that design is, it's an aluminum shell. Right, so it's a large aluminum shell on a wooden post that gets high up in the air, maybe like 15 feet high, because bats like to have space that they can drop out of the box, open up their wings and fly, right? They don't want to, have to use more energy than they need to get lift. So you want to get it a little bit up in the air. The aluminum shell is painted 2 different colors. It's painted black on the top and it's painted white on the bottom. And on the top, there's drilled a couple of air holes, right? And so what happens is when it's extremely hot, well, whenever it's warm, whenever there's any temperature, the hot air is going to rise to the top half of the bat box. And on colder periods, bats gravitate to those black areas within the box so that they can be as warm as possible, which is great for raising young. If it gets very hot, a lot of the hot air starts venting out of the air holes and bats start to scoot down to the white area of the box. I've seen colonies of little brown bats, Indiana bats, northern long-eared bats in those boxes. I think they're incredibly successful. Some people prefer what's called the rocket box, and rocket boxes are also great, right? Rocket boxes, you can find designs for them online. I don't know of anywhere you can purchase them for money, although they might exist. Essentially, yeah, Marnie's shaking her head. Essentially, a rocket box mimics a tree, right? So it's also on a large post, but the box is not a box in the way that people typically visualize a bat box. But what it is multiple chambers that are like a square that surround the post, almost like dead bark on a tree. And it was designed to sort of mimic a dead tree. And that's really like those. Yeah. Those are my 2 favorite designs. And I'm sure we can find those resources to throw out to people.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that aluminum one. I'm gonna have to look that one up, but it reminded me.
I can send you designs.
That'd be great. That'd be awesome. Yeah. Especially for tomorrow. So what about the Brandon bark? That kind of sounded similar to the aluminum, though obviously not color, but that's one that actually looks like tree bark. I thought there's some success with that one too.
I've heard great things about the Brandon bark. I don't have anything bad to say about it other than it's proprietary and costs some money. However, the rocket boxes to someone who's inclined with woodworking are approachable. To me, you might as well ask me to build a car. I have 0 chance of building a rocket box. However, one thing that I've been trying to find is a good partner to help build, especially the aluminum shells. My partner in Pennsylvania essentially shops them out and gets people to bid on who produces shells. And he gets bids from anywhere from, he gets a lot of bids on how to build them effectively and then distributes them to homeowners. And that would be something that I would like to try and do. But I have more ideas than I have capacity. So if anyone has the ability, to build aluminum boxes with me, reach out. We'll start ramping these things up and distributing to people. I would like that.
I think just starting the plans alone would be great. I know I, for one, and I'm sure other folks on the call have had scout groups and other groups reach out to us like, hey, we need bat house plans. We want to do this. And, you try to hand them a plan that they can do and that is going to be effective. So for me, it's usually the rocket box. But like you said, that's a little bit more complicated. And so anyways, good stuff. All right. Back to our questions. Emma's asking, are we expecting white nose syndrome to spread dramatically with rising temperatures caused by climate change?
So one of the things about white nose syndrome is that it's a cold loving fungus. And so it likes to have the temperature. I mean, I say 10 degrees because it's easy for people to conceptualize, but the sweet spot is like 12.3 degrees Celsius, which is like 50 something. I can't do 12.3 C to F off the top of my head. So anyway, the warmer it gets from 12.3, actually the slower the fungus grows, and the colder from 12.3, the slower the fungus grows. So the answer to your question depends on where in the world you are, right? If you are at a high latitude and the hibernacula are very cold, if you had sustained above ground warming for several years, that mean annual surface temperature is going to relate to a change in mean annual subterranean temperature, and it could bring you closer to that optimum for the fungus. If you are already at that optimum, right, warming actually, is gonna push the growth range away from optimum. You could also hypothesize that warming winters might relate in more feeding opportunities for bats and more opportunities for them to survive white nose syndrome. You could hypothesize the exact opposite. So right now, essentially, there's a couple of different speculations into what might happen with increased warming, but I would not look at it like increased warming is going to mean increased suitability of environments for the fungus, just because it's so context dependent.
Okay, great. Okay. Aaron is asking, is it a new thing for bats to be found in these non-traditional rock outcropping hibernacula, or is it just that no one has looked for bats in these places until after PD?
Sorry, there's some background noise. I think my neighbor is mowing the yard or something. I don't know why. Anyway, it's the latter. It's that people haven't really looked in these areas. And it's kind of an unfortunate story, but it makes sense. People were able to be a little bit lazy pre-white nose syndrome because you could just go to a cave and see tens of thousands of bats. Why would you want to spend any more effort than you had to find them? But now that bats are rare, we're literally turning over every rock that we can to try and find them.
Yeah. So somewhat related, Susan is asking, will bats use tree bark or tree stump dens as an example of some of these non-traditional hibernacula?
After this question, I'm going to tell my neighbor to move. Sorry, I promise it'll get better.
We can't really hear, honestly.
Oh,
at least I'm not hearing anything on our end, so.
Excellent. So then it's just bothering me and not anybody else. I can suck it up. So I believe the question was, are we expecting bats would use tree bark and stuff in the winter? And that is a very interesting question. Yeah. I think the answer is yes in some areas and no in others. If you are in northern Canada, the odds of surviving in winter in a tree are pretty much zero, right? However, here in Ohio, I think so. Right? I think a bat could survive underneath tree bark and in a tree in the winter months, but I think it's a little bit of a controversial take. So I think we need to collect some data, but I think the answer could be yes.
Elena is asking, can you determine species of bats through the use of bat echolocation detectors?
Could you determine species of bats? Was that the question?
Mm-hmm. Using, detectors.
Yeah. The answer is yes, you can, with an asterisk, right? The majority of times you record a bat during winter, it is not a sufficient recording for a species identification. And the reasons for that are pretty complex. Essentially, a bat call, if you will, is going to bounce off all of the objects in space. And most times you record a bat during winter, or anytime, the call is bouncing off vegetation, it's bouncing off water, rocks, and that distorts the recording. And any little bit of distortion reduces your ability to identify it accurately. Another problem is there's natural overlap in some species. Some species, frustratingly, Indiana bats and little brown bats, their calls look almost identical to each other under even the best of circumstances. So simply by probability, those species, you just need to get like the perfect call in the perfect context. That does happen. You just need to do a lot of recordings. And so in some, the answer is yes, you can, but most times you can't. We overcome this by collecting a ton of data.
Okay, so Yvette is asking, people are clearing their trees from properties for various reasons. Are there guidelines for the removal to prevent displacing bats?
Yeah, there's lots of guidelines on tree clearing. Most of those guidelines revolve around when. You cannot do tree clearing during the maternity season for bats. So as a result, you don't go out and do a harvest during the middle of summer. Those harvests are going to occur, around now, the winter months. And so there is a lot of regulation in terms of beyond timing. There's not a lot. You could cut down a bat roost during the winter months just fine. because those roosts are typically ephemeral. And so if it's a dead tree, that it's a snag with that peeling plates of bark, those are really only good for bats for a couple of years. So it's not that when you see a dead tree and bats have roosted in it, it's not like people are banned from cutting that tree down in the following winter. There's not that kind of regulation. It's just a matter of when. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. So the next question and comment is from somebody who's having an issue. I don't know if you can see it in the Q&A, it's rather long, but basically he's looking for a recommendation for somebody to come out and evaluate property that is about to be sold for development. He says that it has been evaluated 4 times by the Ohio EPA's 401 DSW process, and apparently Indiana bats have been identified there. He says that there are other significant features such as cliff lines and outcroppings, and he's just wondering who to reach out to maybe, I don't know, prevent this land from being developed, which is a very difficult situation.
Yeah, so these are tough. So one thing that I would say is I can maybe chat with you offline. My email is just joseph.johnson@uc.edu. There's only so many things that people like me can do, because unfortunately, funding for the type of work that I do is really scarce, and we're operating on a shoestring budget as it is. And so there's a limited amount of resources that I would have to go out and help you try and figure out whatever, would help this cause. However, what I would say is, we could chat offline. It sounds like you have some interesting features there, and I would be more than happy to, help you try and evaluate it as best I can, knowing that Akron is quite far from me. And it sounds like your timeline is pronto. And so I'm not sure that I can help pronto, but I might be able to find somebody who would be willing to volunteer to talk and to look. But I will say, unfortunately, when we try and use bats or any animal as like the big stick by which we for lack of a better word, fight a development like this, it doesn't always go the way that we hope. But I would say if you reach out to me, I can at least see if it's, maybe we could exchange photos, you could show me what you have. And I typically don't get involved in this type of situation, at least on the front lines. But if it is important habitat, I can help you document that in some way.
Great, thanks, Joe. Okay, Carol's asking, what happens to the fungus in bats that survive winter with it?
So what happens is it travels with them, right? So when bats leave their hibernation site, they take any fungus with them. And over the next several months, bats just get rid of most of that fungus. It falls off, the stuff in their skin dies. However, it does travel with them quite a bit. And so there's a fair amount of interest in that, because if we were to go to the Wayback Machine here, to the crummy map that I hate so much, right? There's a reason why this fungus spread so fast. And the reason why and let me be clear, the fungus got to North America through people. A bat did not fly across the Atlantic Ocean and bring this fungus here. We actually have a fairly good idea over how people brought the fungus to this cave. Now, the way that it spread among these hibernation sites is by bats. Bats are very effective at spreading the fungus along their migratory routes. So when these bats go from cave to cave to cave in the fall, they are spreading it around phenomenally fast. And when bats leave in the spring, and maybe they go to a building roost, maybe they spend some of their roosting time in a cave, they do a very good job of being a vector, unfortunately, for that fungus. However, I will say that by the middle of the summer, there's little to no fungus left on these bats. But studies do sometimes find like a very small amount left there. But if you see a bat in say late July, I wouldn't be too concerned about what its fungal load is. It's probably at that point been away from it a long time, and maybe more pertinent to your question, it can't grow in the bat. And maybe that's an important thing to point out, is once the bat is out of the cave and mine, the temperature that the fungus is exposed to is so warm that it can't grow. That fungus just won't grow beyond like 18 degrees Celsius. And once it gets too warm, it actually will just, get deformed and it will be not viable anymore. So the fungus is very specific to a very narrow range, so to speak, of underground temperatures.
Excellent. Just a reminder, folks, we will be posting this recording, including all the questions. Had a question there asking about that. And we'll keep on moving through these. So Laura's asking, do man-made bat houses provide places for hibernation, or are the bats finding other places to hibernate?
So big brown bats you can find during a warmish point in the winter. It's not typically common to see them in a bat house during winter. And I would say that they're not really good hibernacula during winter, but they're good alternative roosts on a warm day when these bats are doing whatever it is that big brown bats do. They're really hardy, fun bats in that sense. However, a good hibernacula needs to be buffered from extreme cold. And bat boxes should not be designed that way, because if a bat box has that amount of insulation, it's probably not going to be a suitable summer roost for that reason. So a good bat box in the summer would be too variable to be used except for an odd winter day, but they're still valuable during those odd days.
Related, Carol's asking, is there anything people can build to help bats out in the winter, some sort of structure?
So this is an interesting thing. So I am experimenting with that, but I don't know what the answer is. So I don't want to tell you an answer that I determine a couple of years from now is just hogwash. I don't know. I think it's such a good question that I am thinking about it myself, but I don't know how yet, because our understanding of these structures is so in its infancy that while I could take a guess, I wouldn't want to tell people to do things based on a guess. Sorry.
No,
it's just not good.
We're still learning.
Yeah.
Anne has an interesting question. When bats are in hibernation, does their urea get recycled and transferred into proteins, similar to what happens with bears?
I don't know. I have seen nothing on that. It's a good question. I'm going to guess no. Because when bats do wake up out of hibernation, they do urinate. So when they arouse, they do urinate. So I assume that it's just stored in the bladder and excreted, but I've never seen a study on that. That's a really great question. And I think it just speaks to how interesting the hibernation period is, and just how sad it is to have lost our natural population that we would learn all of these fascinating bits of physiology from, because now bats are so rare that our ability to even ask these questions is greatly hindered.
Yeah, it really makes you mourn the time lost. Okay, Marjorie is asking, besides mosquitoes, what types of insects do bats eat?
Yeah, how much time do we have? So
no flying insect is safe.
Yeah, no, that's such a good way to describe it. No flying insect is safe. And a good example of that is I used to get asked all the time if bats eat Luna moths. And I would kind of snicker and I'd be like, I think that's crazy. Like Luna moths are so big. I can't imagine, but there was a cool study and research, suggesting that some of the long tails, if you will, on Luna moths help distract attacking bats. And that was like a really good example of like, how I felt stupid about a once pretty strong stance that I took. And it really does highlight that no flying insect at night is safe. And really, it's not even a flying insect. So to try and answer your question, anything that's an insect, that's nocturnal, and that's in an exposed area is under threat. So that includes pretty much any type of beetle. That includes any type of true bug, the Hemiptera. Aquatic insects like a Ephemeroptera, fabulous prey. Aquatic dipterans, flies, fabulous prey. Moths, some people say that moths are like the best of all prey because they're mostly just, they're mostly just the digestible parts, right? They're not covered with a hard chitinous exoskeleton like a beetle is. Really, the most undigestible parts of a moth are the scales on the wing, but they've just got a big juicy body. So moths are like fabulous food, but some bats are adapted to go after mostly beetles. So pretty much anything is fair game. And most of the time, people think about bats as feeding off insects that they catch in midair. Maybe they've seen a bat doing some acrobatics over a field at dusk. But there are some species of bats that actually do what we call gleaning, which is taking insects off the surface of vegetation. So they fly slowly up to maybe a tree, maybe an insect that's on a leaf. And what they do is they listen for any sound the bug makes, maybe scratching around on the surface of the tree or on a leaf, and they passively listen for those sounds and they ambush the prey. So bats and insects have a really, in some case, interesting arms race against each other.
Very cool. Emma's asking, can bat populations be captive bred to help protect those that are threatened or endangered?
I won't say no, right? Because I think we should probably always leave things on the table for conservation. But there are some cautionary tales about this. Very early on in white nose syndrome, there was an effort to take Virginia big-eared bats into captivity. And Virginia big-eared bats are a species we don't have in Ohio, but pretty much all of the global population, like 90+% of the global population is in like 2 sites. And so the attitude was, once white nose syndrome gets into these sites, this whole species is in trouble. And so they took a small amount into captivity, and it did not go well at all. And it turns out that Virginia big-eared bats seem to somehow be resistant to white nose syndrome. So that was a fortunate part of the story, but it didn't go well. And one of the reasons why it doesn't go well is bats are really good at getting fat. They are excellent at gaining weight whenever they can, because they're always preparing for a hard period, right? Females are preparing for a very demanding lactation period. Then they're trying to recover everything they lost from lactation and get ready for winter. Juvenile bats of any sex, once they come out of the womb, they have a month or so to get ready to fly. And then they have 2 months to get ready to hibernate. So these bats are really good at getting fat. And unless you have a really good outdoor environment, you end up with little, and this is true of insectivorous bats. So there's lots of good captive colonies with non-insectivorous bats, but temperate North American insectivorous species that I've seen end up being just morbidly obese in captivity. Another thing that's challenging is some people believe that bats need to hibernate to reproduce, that there is this obligation for them to go through this period of hibernation and then come out of it in order for ovulation to occur. This is not agreed upon, but I've heard it suggested because it's very hard to get bats to breed, insectivorous, North American species, hard to get them to breed in captivity. And in captive colonies generally don't, like captive big brown bats generally don't reproduce. And I've heard it suggested that they need a winter hibernation period. So right now, I would say that sure, it's something that could be on the table. However, the animal husbandry for an insectivorous bat has not been very, it's not been mastered.
Yeah. Joe, would you mind if I shared your email in the chat box while I ask you the next question? There's been a couple. Okay. So Craig, hi Craig, is asking about, has research been done with inoculating known summer homes with a protective fungicide?
Probably, but I don't know about it. There has, well, okay. So yes, actually, so it depends. The non-summer home part, I think, threw me for a loop. So there has been a lot of work on treatments for white nose syndrome. And in some cases, those treatments are an active fungicide. In some cases, the treatments are what's called a volatile organic compound that is not a fungicide, but inhibits the growth of fungus. Essentially, it's something that has a gaseous form that inhibits the fungal growth. There's been lots of experimentation with this stuff. I am part of one of these studies. We don't use a fungicide. In this case, we use a non-biocide. We actually use a compound that you eat every day. It's in your toothpaste. It's in dog food. It's sprayed on fruits and vegetables. It's shockingly ubiquitous. And actually, interestingly, broken down by bacteria in the environment, so it doesn't accumulate for something so ubiquitous. And we do experiment with some of this, and it does reduce fungal loads in the environment. Now, how useful this as a treatment is a matter of much debate. I would not be allowed to use this treatment, even though it's not a biocide. I would never be allowed to use that in a cave in this state. And that's not shade being thrown anywhere. That's just an honest guess, because people would be concerned if I was to spray a chemical, even one that we think is safe, into the environment. That would be a no-no. And so this has some limited number of applications. However, it does seem to have some promise in the limited number of applications. And so it's a long way of saying yes. I think a non-fungicide is actually better than a true fungicide because we're not killing anything. And I would say that it's not a silver bullet. It's very useful in a very niche environment, like a man-made environment that there's not as many concerned parties about, but are still important to bats. And that I think about it as being on the table with the other things that we think about, right? Managing forests around Hibernacula to help bats get fat. Again, these non-biocide agents. And then also we spend time manipulating Hibernacula. That's something I've talked about and is also somewhat controversial. So I wouldn't say that everyone should go out and manipulate environments, but that is something that I do. And we find that to be quite successful in Pennsylvania as well.
Great. A couple questions about forest type and specific trees. So Frank is asking, is forest type important for bats? I thought that shagbark hickory and mature white oaks are important for summer roosts. Snags attract lots of wildlife, and wouldn't the bats be safer under bark of a healthy tree? What are implications for landowners if all these bats go to the endangered species list? So loaded question there.
Yeah, and maybe I want to repeat some of it because I was really focused on one part of it. So I'm going to answer one part of it, and then Marnie, you can tell me the parts that I missed. Types of forests and types of trees. One thing that I would say is there's a lot of research on this, and there's a lot of disagreement. A lot of bat biologists, not all, a lot of bat biologists think that forest structure is more important than forest type. So what do I mean by forest structure? Essentially, non-even aged forests that have a steady recruitment of large dead trees. So, in English, the structure here would be a forest that did not grow up around a clear cut, that has, because those forests, at least for a period of time, will have a dense number of small stems that are all stems being trees that are all competing with one another. It ends up being overcrowded. The trees don't grow as fast. They don't grow as large as fast. And that forests are dense and hard for bats to move through. They're great at avoiding obstacles, but they'd rather have a little bit of an easier time if they can. So what even-aged forests relate to for bats is they'll have these large canopy gaps that occur when you have a tree just naturally die, become a roost for a period of time. And during that period of time, bats might roost under the bark, but then that tree just goes through its senescence process. It becomes unsuitable for bats. And then several years later, it falls down. And that canopy gap is a place for bats to forage. It gets more sunlight. It gets some diverse understory compared to the rest of the forest. This is just an example of what uneven aged forest looks like from a bat's perspective. And some bat biologists believe that these complex forest environments are very good for bats and that they matter more than the individual tree species. That doesn't mean that some tree species are better than others, though. I wouldn't say that. And when you ask about shagbark hickory, I like to throw some shade on shagbark hickory. And I like the tree. I love the tree. I plant the tree. However, one thing that I would say about them is they are, they're like a poor bat's roost. What do I mean by that? A bat would much rather have a tree, most bats that roost under plates of bark, which is a very minority number of bats. They like to have these large peeling plates. Why do they like that? Because bats are social. Bats like to form groups of hundreds of individuals if they can in a tree. And you can't get those under those peeling bits of a shagbark hickory. You need a bigger area to have a large social group. It does seem counterintuitive, right? Why would you want to roost in this structure that's only good for a short period of time, right? This piece of bark is going to fall off. The tree is going to become unsuitable in a couple of years. It seemed like an untenable strategy for a bat to roost in a structure like this, as opposed to a shagbark hickory, which is alive and going to be around for a long period of time. However, you need to step back and think about how bats lived before large-scale commercial forestry. They would live in forests with many dead trees. And as a result, bats don't just have one roost in a forest. They have several roosts in the forest, and they rotate among them. They are ready to lose a roost at any time. However, in many managed forests, if they're not managed to recruit dead trees and maintain dead trees, they have few options. And then in that context, the shagbark hickory becomes desirable. However, it's not the way bats are, it's not what bats are used to, and it's not what bats seem to prefer. There's a whole second part of that question I forgot.
So what are the implications for landowners if all of these bats go to the endangered species list?
It's in some ways, we need to remember that in Ohio, we already had an endangered forest bat. And because of that endangered forest bat, the Indiana bat, there was already a temporal restriction on when you could clear forests. Adding the northern long-eared bat won't change that. Adding the little brown bat won't change that. Adding the tricolored bat, boy, I don't know. It probably won't change that, but tricolored bats roost in different structures. However, if you're avoiding timber harvest during the summer months for the bats that roost in snags, you're already avoiding the live trees for tricolored bats. So really for forest management, I don't think, I'm not a legal expert. I don't really work in the inner workings of the ESA, but I think it's probably going to be a similar system for forest management because you were already navigating these problems for the Indiana bats to begin with. There's other aspects of management that might be more challenging, and those are the aspects that I welcome, actually, especially protection of winter habitat. I think will be where the story changes the most, because right now there are few areas where we have Indiana bats hibernating in the winter, and there's few areas where we have northern long-eared bats, which is threatened, and threatened really gave them no protection. And to be completely honest, it wasn't useful. Sorry if anyone's in the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was not useful to me to have them be threatened. It was too easy to just skirt around. But we can now protect habitats that are important for these bats in winter when we could not before. I think that's where the biggest change occurs. But for forest management, I think it's going to be kind of the same. But I don't know. That's not really the world I work in. Marnie, if you think otherwise, please chime in.
No, I think you answered it pretty succinctly, I think, and there's going to be some waiting and seeing what happens too. Okay, so we are almost out of time. I want to make sure that Kathy has time to put the continuing education link in the chat box. But before we do that, we're going to do we're going to do one more question, and then Kathy, you can do it because we stopped the recording. And sorry for folks if we didn't get your questions answered. Feel free to reach out to me or even Joe. And the last question is kind of a fun one, if I can find where it went from. I don't know who said it, but they're asking, what projects in science related to bats are you most excited about for Joe into the future?
Me, and I am a very different person. Some people don't like this idea and dislike me for it. I'm going to build a cave in the next year. And I am very excited to start creating design requirements to build winter hibernation sites to essentially be able to answer questions like the ones that you asked me. How do I provide a winter habitat for bats? I want to start creating like a recipe for that is easily replicable for people no matter where they are. That's what I am personally most excited for. I like the underground. I'm excited to make the underground and create ways to buffer it against climate change and white nose syndrome.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording